My name is Sarah, and I've been a senior nurse at Metropolitan General Hospital for 15 years. In those 15 years, I've seen it all. The miracles, the tragedies, the politics, and the power games that happen behind closed doors. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for what I would discover about Dr. Alistair Croft and how far I would go to make him pay for his arrogance, his betrayal, and his complete disregard for everything sacred in both his professional and personal life. This is the story of how I brought down the most untouchable surgeon in our hospital, not through official channels, not through human resources, but through something far more devastating. The truth delivered to the one person who deserved to know it most: his pregnant wife. Let me start at the beginning, because you need to understand the kind of man Dr. Alistair Croft was before his world came crashing down. He was the chief of surgery, a man who walked through our hospital corridors like he owned them, because in many ways he did. Patients requested him specifically, administrators kissed his feet, and younger doctors worshipped the ground he walked on. He was brilliant, I'll give him that. But brilliance without humility is just arrogance wearing a lab coat, and Dr. Croft had enough arrogance to fill the entire hospital. For years, I had maintained a professional relationship with him. He respected my experience, acknowledged my expertise, and we worked together efficiently. The operating room was our battlefield, and we were both warriors who knew how to save lives. But everything changed 6 months ago when Dr. Jessica Reynolds arrived as our new surgical intern. Fresh out of medical school, beautiful, ambitious, and hungry for success. In any other scenario, I would have been happy to mentor her, to show her the ropes, to help her navigate the complex world of hospital politics and patient care. But Dr. Jessica Reynolds was different. She had something most interns don't have: protection from the very top. It started subtly. Little things that only someone with my experience would notice. Jessica would arrive late to morning rounds, but instead of being reprimanded, Dr. Croft would smile and say, "Dr. Reynolds, so glad you could join us." When she made mistakes during procedures, and she made many, he would cover for her, explaining away her errors as learning experiences, while other interns were publicly humiliated for far less. She began questioning my instructions in front of other staff members, something that would have been career suicide for any other intern. But Jessica did it with a confidence that suggested she knew she was untouchable. The first major red flag came during a routine appendectomy. I was setting up the surgical instruments when Jessica grabbed a scalpel without following proper sterilization protocol. I immediately intervened, explaining that she needed to re-sterilize the instrument to prevent infection. Instead of acknowledging her mistake, she looked at me with this smug expression and said, "Dr. Croft told me that experienced nurses sometimes get too caught up in outdated procedures. He said efficiency is more important than following every single rule to the letter." The audacity of her statement left me speechless. This was a woman who had been practicing medicine for all of 6 months, telling me, a nurse with 15 years of experience, that I was following outdated procedures. But what really confirmed my suspicions was Dr. Croft's reaction. Instead of supporting proper protocol, instead of backing up the senior nurse who had been preventing infections and saving lives long before Dr. Reynolds had even decided to go to medical school, he simply said, "Sarah, let's focus on the patient. We can discuss protocols later." He dismissed me. In front of the entire surgical team, he dismissed my concerns about patient safety to protect his precious intern. If you're watching this video, you probably understand what it feels like to see injustice unfold right in front of your eyes. You probably know what it's like to watch someone abuse their power while the people who could stop them choose to look the other way. That's exactly what hospital revenge is about. Those moments when the system fails and ordinary people have to take justice into their own hands. If you want to hear more stories about the dark side of hospital politics and the revenge that follows, make sure to subscribe to Hospital Revenge, because trust me, this is just the beginning. The pattern continued for weeks. Jessica would make increasingly bold moves, always with Dr. Croft's protection. She would ignore my instructions, contradict my recommendations, and generally behave as if she was above the hierarchy that governs every hospital in the world. But it wasn't just about disrespect. It was about patient safety. Her arrogance was becoming dangerous. She was cutting corners, ignoring protocols, and putting people's lives at risk. because she knew that Dr. Croft would always have her back. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning in October. We were scheduled for a complex cardiac procedure, and I had spent the previous evening reviewing the patient's file, preparing the surgical suite, and ensuring that every instrument was properly sterilized and ready. This was a high-risk operation, and there was no room for error. Jessica arrived 20 minutes late, which was becoming her standard practice, but this time she brought an attitude that crossed every line of professional behavior. "Sarah," she said, not even bothering to look at me while she reviewed the patient file. "I've been thinking about the way you organize the surgical instruments. Dr. Croft and I discussed it, and we think there might be a more efficient way to arrange everything. He suggested that I take the lead on instrument preparation for today's procedure." I felt my blood pressure rise. Taking the lead on instrument preparation wasn't just about organizing tools. It was about understanding the surgeon's preferences, knowing the exact sequence of the procedure, and being able to anticipate every need before it was voiced. It was a responsibility that came with experience, not with sleeping with the right person. "Dr. Reynolds," I said, keeping my voice steady despite the anger building inside me, "instrument preparation is my responsibility. I've been doing this for 15 years, and I know Dr. Croft's preferences better than anyone. Your job as an intern is to observe and learn, not to reorganize systems that have been working perfectly for years." She looked at me with that same smug expression. But this time, there was something else in her eyes, something that looked almost like pity. "Sarah, I understand that change can be difficult, especially for people who have been doing things the same way for a long time. But medicine is evolving, and sometimes that means adapting to new approaches. Dr. Croft specifically asked me to take on more responsibility, and I'm not going to let him down." The dismissal in her voice was unmistakable. She was talking to me like I was an obstacle to be overcome, not a colleague to be respected. But what happened next was even worse. Dr. Croft entered the surgical suite, and Jessica immediately approached him with a smile that was far too familiar for a professional relationship. "Good morning, Dr. Croft," she said, practically purring his name. "I was just discussing with Sarah how we might improve our instrument preparation process. I think there's real potential for increased efficiency." Dr. Croft looked at me with an expression that I had never seen before. It wasn't the respect I had earned over 15 years of exemplary service. It wasn't the professional courtesy that senior staff members typically showed each other. It was the look of someone who had already decided that I was expendable. "Sarah," he said, his voice carrying that tone of condescending authority that powerful men use when they want to remind you of your place. "I appreciate your dedication to established procedures. But Dr. Reynolds has some excellent ideas about modernizing our approach. I think it would be beneficial for everyone if we allowed her to implement some changes." I felt something inside me snap. Not break, snap. Like a rubber band that had been stretched too far and finally reached its limit. This wasn't just about respect anymore. This wasn't just about hierarchy or professional courtesy. This was about patient safety, about the integrity of our medical practice, and about the fact that Dr. Croft was willing to compromise both to protect his little affair. "Dr. Croft," I said, my voice steady but carrying 15 years of accumulated authority. "With all due respect, Dr. Reynolds has been here for 6 months. She has observed dozens of procedures, but she has never been the primary instrument nurse for a cardiac operation of this complexity. Patient safety should be our first priority, not experimenting with new approaches during high-risk procedures." The silence that followed was deafening. Dr. Croft's face darkened, and for a moment, I thought he might actually consider the wisdom of my words. But then Jessica placed her hand on his arm, a gesture that was far too intimate for a professional setting, and whispered something in his ear that I couldn't hear. "Sarah," Dr. Croft said, his voice now carrying a sharp edge, "I think you're overreacting. Dr. Reynolds is a highly capable physician, and I have complete confidence in her abilities. If you're not comfortable with adapting to new methods, perhaps you should consider whether this is the right assignment for you." The threat was clear. 15 years of service, 15 years of perfect performance reviews, 15 years of saving lives and preventing complications, and he was threatening to remove me from the surgical team because I wouldn't enable his girlfriend's dangerous incompetence. I looked around the surgical suite at the other nurses and technicians who were pretending not to listen to our conversation. I saw the uncomfortable expressions, the averted eyes, the body language of people who knew exactly what was happening but were too afraid to speak up. And in that moment, I realized that I was completely alone in my fight against this corruption. "Of course, Dr. Croft," I said, forcing a smile that probably looked more like a grimace. "I'm always willing to adapt to new approaches. Dr. Reynolds, please proceed with the instrument preparation. I'll be here to assist if needed." The procedure was a disaster waiting to happen. Jessica arranged the instruments in a way that made no sense, ignored the specific sequence that Dr. Croft had used for years, and generally created chaos in what should have been a perfectly organized surgical environment. But the real catastrophe came when she contaminated a critical instrument and then tried to use it anyway. I watched in horror as she picked up a scalpel that had clearly been compromised, preparing to hand it to Dr. Croft for a delicate incision near the patient's heart. Without thinking, I stepped forward and grabbed her wrist. "That instrument is contaminated," I said, my voice carrying the urgency of someone who had just prevented a potentially fatal infection. "You need to replace it immediately." Jessica looked at me with shock and anger, but Dr. Croft's reaction was even worse. Instead of thanking me for preventing a catastrophic mistake, instead of acknowledging that I had just saved his patient's life, he turned on me with a fury that I had never seen before. "Sarah!" he shouted, his voice echoing through the surgical suite. "You do not grab my surgical team members. You do not create disruptions during delicate procedures. Your behavior is completely unacceptable." I stood there, holding the contaminated instrument, staring at a man who had just prioritized his affair over patient safety. The room was silent, except for the steady beeping of the heart monitor, and I realized that everyone was looking at me like I was the problem, like I was the one who had created this situation. "Dr. Croft," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "This instrument was contaminated. Using it could have caused a serious infection." "That's enough," he shouted again. "You're clearly not capable of working as part of this team. I want you out of my surgical suite immediately." I left the operating room with my head held high, but inside I was dying. 15 years of service, and I had been humiliated in front of my colleagues for doing my job, for protecting a patient, for following the protocols that had been drilled into me since my first day of nursing school. I spent the rest of that day in a daze, going through the motions of my other responsibilities while my mind processed what had happened. But it wasn't until later that evening, when I was finishing my shift, that I learned the full extent of what I was dealing with. Chloe Martinez was one of our younger nurses, a sweet girl who had graduated from nursing school just 2 years ago. She was the kind of person who still believed in the nobility of our profession, who hadn't yet become cynical about hospital politics and power games. She approached me at the nurses' station with tears in her eyes and a look of absolute devastation on her face. "Sarah," she said, her voice breaking, "I need to talk to you about something, about what happened today in the surgical suite." I looked at her closely and realized that she was more than upset. She was angry. Angry in the way that only truly good people can be when they see injustice happening right in front of them. "What is it, Chloe?" I asked, although I had a feeling I already knew what she was going to tell me. She looked around to make sure no one else was listening, then leaned in closer. "After you left the operating room, I heard them talking, Dr. Croft and Dr. Reynolds. They were laughing, Sarah, laughing about what happened to you." The words hit me like a physical blow. They had been laughing, while I was questioning my entire career, while I was wondering if 15 years of service meant nothing. They had been laughing about my humiliation. "But that's not the worst part," Chloe continued, her voice getting stronger as her anger grew. "Dr. Reynolds said something that made me sick to my stomach. She said, 'Sarah needs to learn her place. She's just a nurse, and she needs to remember that doctors make the decisions, not her.'" Gee. I felt my hands clench into fists. The casual dismissal of my profession, the reduction of my 15 years of experience to just a nurse, the complete disregard for everything I had contributed to that hospital. It was more than insulting. It was dehumanizing. "And then," Chloe said, her voice now shaking with emotion, "Dr. Croft said something that made everything clear. He said, 'Don't worry about Sarah. She's old school, set in her ways. She'll retire soon, And then we won't have to deal with her resistance to change. The word retire hit me like a sledgehammer. They weren't just planning to humiliate me. They were planning to push me out entirely, to end my career so that they could continue their affair without any interference from people who cared about patient safety and professional standards. But it was Chloe's next words that changed everything. "Sarah," she said, tears now streaming down her face, "it's not fair. The surgeon is sleeping with the new intern, and everyone knows it, but no one will do anything about it. She's getting special treatment, she's putting patients at risk, and she's destroying the morale of everyone who actually cares about doing their job right. It's not fair, and someone needs to stop it." There it was, the truth that everyone knew but no one was willing to say out loud. Dr. Alistair Croft, the respected chief of surgery, the man who had built his reputation on precision and excellence, was sleeping with his intern. And that affair wasn't just a personal matter. It was affecting patient care. It was creating a hostile work environment, and it was destroying the integrity of our entire surgical program. "You're right, Chloe," I said, my voice steady despite the storm of emotions raging inside me. "It's not fair, and someone does need to stop it." That night, I went home to my small apartment and sat in my kitchen, staring at the wall and trying to process everything that had happened. I thought about reporting the situation to Human Resources, but I knew that would be a dead end. Dr. Croft was too powerful, too connected, too valuable to the hospital's bottom line. HR would listen politely, file a report, and then quietly suggest that I might be happier working somewhere else. I thought about going to the hospital administration, but they were the ones who had promoted Dr. Croft to chief of surgery in the first place. They had invested too much in his reputation to let a senior nurse bring him down, no matter how legitimate her concerns might be. I thought about talking to other doctors, but they were all either intimidated by Dr. Croft's power or jealous of his success. None of them would risk their own careers to support a nurse's complaint about professional impropriety. That's when I realized that the system wasn't going to help me. The official channels, the proper procedures, the professional protocols, none of them were designed to protect people like me from people like Dr. Croft. They were designed to protect the hospital, to protect the doctors, to protect the people who generated revenue and prestige. But Dr. Croft had made one crucial mistake in his calculation. He had assumed that his affair was a private matter, that his betrayal of his wife was separate from his professional misconduct. He had assumed that I would focus on the workplace harassment and ignore the personal devastation he was causing at home. He was wrong. The next morning, I arrived at work with a new sense of purpose. I wasn't going to fight Dr. Croft on his terms anymore. I wasn't going to play by rules that were designed to protect him and destroy me. I was going to find another way to make him pay for his arrogance, his betrayal, and his complete disregard for everyone around him. The opportunity came from an unexpected source. Chloe approached me during lunch break with her phone in her hand and an expression of pure disgust on her face. "Sarah," she said, "you need to see this. It's Dr. Reynolds' Instagram account." I looked at her curiously. "Her Instagram account? It's supposed to be private," Chloe explained. "But she accepted my follow request a few weeks ago. I think she assumes that all the nurses worship her like the doctors do. But look at this photo she posted last night." She handed me her phone, and I found myself looking at a picture that made my blood run cold. It was Dr. Jessica Reynolds and Dr. Alistair Croft, sitting together at what looked like an upscale bar, both holding cocktails and smiling at the camera. They were sitting close together, his arm around her shoulders, looking for all the world like a couple celebrating something special. But it wasn't the intimacy of their pose that caught my attention. It was the background of the photo. "Do you see it?" Chloe asked, pointing at the wall behind them. I looked more closely and felt my heart start to race. On the wall of what was clearly Dr. Croft's apartment, there was a series of framed photographs. And those photographs weren't just any pictures. They were ultrasound images. Black and white sonogram photos that showed the unmistakable shape of a developing baby. "Oh my God," I whispered, zooming in on the image. "Are those ultrasound photos?" Chloe confirmed. "And look at the frame next to them." I adjusted the zoom and saw something that made my hands start to shake. Next to the ultrasound photos was a decorative frame containing a single line of text. "Awaiting baby Croft. Due March 2024. The implications hit me like a freight train. Dr. Croft wasn't just cheating on his wife. He was cheating on his pregnant wife. While she was at home, carrying his child, dealing with morning sickness and doctor's appointments and all the fears and joys that come with pregnancy, he was out at bars with his intern, taking photos in his apartment like he was some kind of bachelor celebrating his freedom. "Sarah," Chloe said, her voice barely above a whisper. "His wife is pregnant. She's pregnant and he's cheating on her with Dr. Reynolds. And they're so arrogant, so confident that they'll never get caught, that they're taking pictures in his apartment with the ultrasound photos right there on the wall." I stared at the phone screen, my mind racing through the implications. This wasn't just about workplace harassment anymore. This wasn't just about professional misconduct or patient safety. This was about a man who was destroying his family, betraying the woman who was carrying his child, and doing it all while acting like he was untouchable. "Chloe," I said, my voice steady despite the storm of emotions raging inside me. "I need you to screenshot this photo. High resolution, full size. Can you do that?" She nodded, her fingers already working on the phone. "Sarah, what are you thinking?" I looked at her, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of clarity that cut through all the confusion and anger. "I'm thinking that Dr. Croft's wife deserves to know what kind of man she married. I'm thinking that she deserves to know that while she's preparing for their first child, he's celebrating with another woman. I'm thinking that some betrayals are so fundamental, so devastating, that they require a personal response. Before I continue with this story, I need to ask you something. Do you believe that some betrayals are so grave that revenge becomes a moral obligation? When someone destroys not just their workplace but their family, when they betray not just their colleagues but their pregnant wife, do the normal rules of professional conduct still apply? I want to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And if you're finding this story as compelling as I am, make sure to hit that like button. And let me know that you want to hear more stories about justice served cold. The plan formed in my mind with crystalline clarity. I wasn't going to go to HR. I wasn't going to file a complaint with the medical board. I wasn't going to fight Dr. Croft in any arena where he held the advantage. Instead, I was going to do something that would hurt him far more than any professional sanction ever could. I was going to tell his wife. But I wasn't going to call her, or send her an email, or try to explain the situation in words that she might choose not to believe. I was going to send her proof, undeniable, photographic proof of her husband's betrayal, delivered in a way that would make the reality of his affair impossible to ignore or rationalize away. "Chloe," I said, "I need you to send me that screenshot. And then I need you to help me find Dr. Croft's home address." "Nay," she looked at me with wide eyes. "Sarah, what are you planning to do?" "I'm planning to make sure that Eleanor Croft, that's his wife's name, knows exactly what kind of man she married before she brings his child into this world. She deserves to know. She deserves to have all the information before she makes decisions about her future." Chloe was quiet for a long moment, staring at the phone screen. Then she looked up at me with an expression of grim determination. "You're right. She does deserve to know. And if the system won't hold him accountable for what he's doing at work, maybe she'll hold him accountable for what he's doing at home." That evening, we put our plan into action with the precision of a surgical procedure. Chloe sent me the high-resolution screenshot, and I printed it on photo paper using the printer at my apartment. The image was crystal clear. Dr. Croft and Dr. Reynolds at the bar, his arm around her, both of them smiling, and in the background, unmistakably visible, the ultrasound photos and the awaiting baby Croft frame. Finding Dr. Croft's home address was easier than I had expected. Hospital employee records were confidential, but Dr. Croft had been featured in several local magazine articles about prominent physicians, and one of them had mentioned the exclusive neighborhood where he lived. A little bit of online research gave us his exact address. I drove to an office supply store and bought a simple manila envelope and a sheet of standard copy paper. I didn't want anything that could be traced back to me. No special paper, no distinctive handwriting, no return address. Just a plain envelope with a clear message. On the sheet of copy paper, I typed a single sentence. "Your husband's celebration dinner with Dr. Jessica Reynolds. Note the ultrasound photos on his apartment wall." I printed it on plain white paper, folded it around the photograph, and placed both items in the manila envelope. On the front of the envelope, I wrote Mrs. Eleanor Croft in block letters, using my non-dominant hand to disguise my natural handwriting. Below her name, I wrote Dr. Croft's home address. No return address, no postmark that could be traced to my neighborhood, just a simple envelope containing a truth that would change everything. I drove to a post office in a different part of town and mailed the envelope on a Friday afternoon. As I dropped it into the mail slot, I felt a sense of satisfaction that I hadn't experienced in months. For the first time since Dr. Croft had begun his affair, for the first time since he had started treating me like an obstacle to be overcome, I felt like I had taken back some measure of control. The envelope would arrive on Monday morning. Eleanor Croft would open it, probably expecting some kind of promotional material or medical information. Instead, she would find photographic proof that her husband was cheating on her while she was pregnant with their first child. She would see the ultrasound photos on his apartment wall, the same photos that should have been in their home, in their nursery, symbolizing their shared joy and anticipation. Instead, they were serving as a backdrop for his infidelity. I spent the weekend in a state of nervous anticipation. Part of me wondered if I was doing the right thing, if I had the right to insert myself into Dr. Croft's personal life, if his marital problems were really any of my business. But then I would remember his arrogance, his willingness to put patients at risk to protect his affair, his plan to force me into retirement so he could continue his misconduct without interference. This wasn't just about his cheating. This was about holding him accountable for all of his actions, professional and personal. This was about making sure that someone, somewhere, would finally say enough to Dr. Alistair Croft and his belief that he was above the rules that governed everyone else. Monday morning arrived with unusual quiet. I arrived at work expecting some kind of immediate explosion, but everything seemed normal. Dr. Croft conducted morning rounds with his usual arrogance. Dr. Aid Reynolds continued her pattern of protected incompetence, and I went about my duties with the same professionalism I had maintained for 15 years. But I could feel the tension building. It was like watching a storm approach from the horizon. You know it's coming. You can feel the electricity in the air, but you don't know exactly when it will hit or how devastating it will be. The first sign came around 10 a.m. Dr. Croft's phone rang during a routine consultation, and he answered it with his usual brisk efficiency. Dr. Croft speaking, but within seconds, his expression changed. The confidence drained from his face, replaced by something I had never seen before. Fear. He stepped away from the patient and walked to the corner of the room, his voice dropping to a whisper. I couldn't hear what he was saying, but I could see his body language. The way his shoulders tensed, the way his free hand clenched into a fist, the way he kept glancing around the room as if he expected someone to be listening. The call lasted about 5 minutes, and when it ended, Dr. Croft looked like a man who had just received a death sentence. His face was pale, his hands were shaking slightly, and when he tried to return to the patient consultation, he couldn't concentrate on what he was doing. Dr. Croft, the patient asked, "Are you feeling all right? You look a bit pale." "I'm fine," he said, but his voice lacked its usual authority. "Just fine. Let's continue with your examination." But he wasn't fine. Over the next hour, I watched him receive 3 more phone calls, each one leaving him more visibly shaken than the last. By noon, he was a completely different person. The arrogant surgeon had been replaced by a man who looked like he was fighting to keep his world from collapsing. The explosion came at 1:30 p.m. Dr. Croft was scheduled to perform a routine gallbladder removal, and I was assigned to the surgical team. As we were preparing for the procedure, his phone rang again. This time, he didn't step away to take the call. This time, he answered it right there in the surgical suite, in front of the entire team. "Eleanor, please," he said, his voice cracking with desperation. "Let me explain. It's not what you think. The photo, there's a reasonable explanation for everything." The silence in the surgical suite was deafening. Every nurse, every technician, every resident was listening to Dr. Croft beg his wife for forgiveness. The man who had built his reputation on absolute control was falling apart in front of everyone. "Eleanor, please don't hang up," he continued, his voice getting louder and more desperate. "I can explain about Jessica. I can explain about everything. Just give me a chance to come home and talk to you face to face." But apparently, Eleanor Croft had heard enough. The call ended abruptly, and Dr. Croft stood there holding his phone, staring at it like he couldn't believe what had just happened. "Dr. Croft," one of the residents said quietly, "should we postpone the procedure?" He looked around the room at all of us, and I saw something in his eyes that I had never seen before: complete and total defeat. The untouchable surgeon, the man who had humiliated me for trying to maintain patient safety standards, was broken. "No," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We'll proceed with the surgery." But he couldn't proceed. His hands were shaking so badly that he couldn't hold the instrument steady. After the third attempt to make the initial incision, the anesthesiologist quietly suggested that perhaps Dr. Croft should take a moment to collect himself. "I'm fine, Doctor," Croft insisted, but everyone could see that he wasn't. "I'm perfectly capable of performing this procedure." That's when Dr. Reynolds, who had been watching the entire scene with growing alarm, made the mistake that sealed both of their fates. "Alistair," she said, forgetting that they were in a professional setting, forgetting that they were supposed to maintain the pretense of a purely professional relationship, "maybe you should take a break. You're obviously upset about your personal situation." The use of his first name, the casual familiarity, the obvious concern for his personal situation. It was like a confession broadcast to the entire surgical team. Every person in that room now knew, without a doubt, that Dr. Jessica Reynolds was intimately involved in Dr. Croft's marital problems. "Dr. Reynolds," he said, his voice sharp with panic, "please maintain professional decorum in the surgical suite." But it was too late. The damage was done. Within hours, word had spread throughout the hospital that Dr. Croft was having an affair with his intern, that his wife had found out, and that his marriage was imploding in spectacular fashion. The next few days were a masterclass in professional destruction. Dr. Croft's phone rang constantly with calls from his wife, his lawyer, his wife's lawyer, and various hospital administrators who were trying to assess the damage to the hospital's reputation. He couldn't concentrate on his work, he couldn't maintain his usual authority, and he couldn't hide the fact that his personal life was in complete chaos. Meanwhile, Dr. Reynolds was dealing with her own set of problems. Word of the affair had reached the medical residency program directors, and they were conducting their own investigation into whether she had received preferential treatment in exchange for sexual favors. Her fellow residents, who had always suspected that she was getting special treatment, were now openly discussing her unprofessional behavior. But the real devastation was yet to come. On Thursday morning, Dr. Croft arrived at work looking like he hadn't slept in days. His usually perfect appearance was disheveled, his eyes were bloodshot, and he moved through the hospital corridors like a man carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. Around 10 a.m., he received a phone call that changed everything. I was at the nurse's station when he answered his phone, and I could hear his voice from across the room. "What do you mean, moved out?" he said, his voice rising with panic. "Eleanor, you can't just take our baby and disappear. We need to talk about this. We need to work through this together." There was a long pause, and then his voice became pleading. "The nursery. What about the nursery? Eleanor, please don't do this. That's our baby's room. Those are our ultrasound photos. You can't just erase everything we've built together." Another pause, and then I heard him say the words that told me my revenge was complete. "Divorce papers? Eleanor, you can't be serious. We're having a baby together. We're supposed to be a family." When the call ended, Dr. Croft stood there in the middle of the corridor, staring at his phone like it contained the ruins of his entire life. Because it did. His wife hadn't just left him. She had moved out of their house, taking with her all the ultrasound photos that had been so prominently displayed in the apartment where he had been entertaining his mistress. She had dismantled the nursery they had prepared together, packed up the baby clothes they had bought together, and hired a divorce attorney who was already preparing to take him for everything he was worth. The irony was perfect. The same ultrasound photos that had provided the evidence of his betrayal were now gone, taken by the woman who had every right to take them. The awaiting baby Croft frame that had been visible in the background of his celebratory photo with Dr. Reynolds was now in a box in his wife's new apartment, a reminder of what he had thrown away for a fling with an intern. But Eleanor Croft wasn't finished with her own revenge. By Friday, word had spread throughout the hospital that she had sent copies of the Instagram photo to several members of the hospital board, along with a detailed letter explaining how her husband's affair was affecting patient care and workplace safety. She had done exactly what I had hoped she would do. She had taken the evidence I provided and used it to launch her own investigation into his professional misconduct. The hospital board called an emergency meeting for the following Monday. Dr. Croft's affair was no longer just a personal matter. It was a professional liability that threatened the hospital's reputation and potentially exposed them to malpractice lawsuits if his compromised judgment had affected patient care. The following Monday morning, Dr. Alistair Croft was called into a meeting with the hospital board, the chief medical officer, and the director of human resources. He emerged from that meeting 2 hours later as a man who had lost everything: his position as chief of surgery, his wife, his unborn child, and his reputation as one of the most respected doctors in the city. Dr. Jessica Reynolds didn't fare much better. The residency program conducted its own investigation and found clear evidence that she had received preferential treatment in exchange for sexual favors. Her residency was terminated immediately, and a formal complaint was filed with the state medical board that would follow her for the rest of her career. The woman who had thought she could sleep her way to the top discovered that some shortcuts lead directly to professional suicide. But the most satisfying moment of my revenge came 3 weeks later, when I was working a late shift and saw Dr. Croft cleaning out his office. Gone was the arrogant swagger, the dismissive attitude, the sense of untouchable authority. He moved through his former domain like a ghost, packing 15 years of achievements into cardboard boxes while avoiding eye contact with anyone who passed by. As he struggled with a particularly heavy box of medical journals, I approached him, not to gloat, not to twist the knife, but to deliver one final message that would make sure he understood exactly what had happened and why. "Dr. Croft," I said, my voice professional but carrying the weight of 15 years of earned authority. He looked up at me with eyes that held no trace of his former arrogance. They were the eyes of a man who had been completely broken, who had lost everything he thought was permanent and secure. "Sarah," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I suppose you're satisfied with how everything turned out." "No, Dr. Croft," I replied, looking directly into his defeated eyes. "I'm not satisfied. Satisfaction would imply that I took pleasure in your destruction. What I feel is something much more profound. I feel justice." He stared at me for a long moment, and I could see him trying to process my words, trying to understand the distinction I was making. "You see," I continued, "this was never about personal satisfaction. This was about consequences. For 15 years, I watched you build your reputation on excellence, precision, and integrity. I respected you, I supported you, and I helped you save lives. But then you threw all of that away for an affair with an intern. And in doing so, you didn't just betray your wife. You betrayed every patient who trusted you, every colleague who respected you, and every principle that makes medicine a noble profession." His face was pale, but he was listening intently, as if he finally understood that this conversation was important in a way that went beyond personal animosity. "When you chose to protect Dr. Reynolds instead of maintaining patient safety standards, when you humiliated me for following protocols that have prevented countless infections and complications, when you planned to force me into retirement so you could continue your affair without professional interference, that's when your betrayal became my responsibility to address." I could see tears forming in his eyes, but I wasn't finished. This man needed to understand the full scope of what he had done and why he had to pay for it. "Your wife didn't deserve to spend her pregnancy wondering why you were working late every night while you were actually celebrating with another woman. She didn't deserve to prepare a nursery for your child while you were taking pictures with your mistress in front of those same ultrasound photos. She didn't deserve to be the last person to know that her husband was destroying their family." Dr. Croft's hands were shaking as he held the box of journals, and I could see that my words were hitting him with the force of absolute truth. "So no, Dr. Croft, I'm not satisfied. I'm vindicated. There's a difference. Satisfaction is temporary, but vindication is permanent. You will carry the consequences of your choices for the rest of your life, and every time you wonder how everything went so wrong so quickly, I want you to remember this conversation. I want you to remember that actions have consequences, that power comes with responsibility, and that betrayal, whether professional or personal, always demands a reckoning." He stood there in silence for almost a full minute, still holding that box, still staring at me with those broken eyes. Finally, he spoke, his voice so quiet, I had to strain to hear him. I'm sorry, Sarah. For what I did to you. For what I did to the hospital. For what I did to my wife. I'm sorry for all of it. I believe you are, I replied. But apologies don't undo consequences. Your wife is filing for divorce, seeking full custody of your child, and demanding alimony that will ensure you remember your betrayal every month for the next 18 years. The hospital board has not only terminated your employment, but also filed formal complaints with the medical licensing board that will make it nearly impossible for you to find another position at a reputable facility. Dr. Reynolds's career is over before it really began, and her name will be associated with professional misconduct for the rest of her life. I paused, watching him process the full scope of his destruction, then delivered my final words. The beautiful thing about justice, Dr. Croft, is that it doesn't require your permission or your understanding. It simply is. You made choices, and now you live with consequences. The system that protected you for so long has turned against you, not because I manipulated it, but because I provided the right person with the truth at the right time. Your wife did the rest. He nodded slowly, shifted the box in his arms, and walked away without another word. I watched him disappear down the corridor, carrying his professional life in cardboard boxes, heading toward a future that would be defined by the wreckage of his own making. 6 months later, I received a letter from Eleanor Croft. She had given birth to a healthy baby girl and had successfully obtained full custody, generous alimony, and a restraining order that prevented Dr. Croft from coming within 500 feet of her or their daughter without court supervision. She thanked me for giving her the information she needed to make informed decisions about her future. And she told me that the anonymous envelope had been the catalyst that allowed her to reclaim control of her life. She also mentioned that Dr. Croft had been working at a small rural clinic, making a fraction of his former salary and living in a studio apartment 40 miles from the city where he had once been considered medical royalty. Dr. Reynolds had left medicine entirely and was working as a pharmaceutical sales representative, a job that required her to smile and charm the same type of doctors who now whispered about her professional disgrace whenever she walked into their offices. But perhaps the most satisfying part of Eleanor's letter was her final paragraph. I want you to know that I named my daughter Sarah, after the nurse who had the courage to tell me the truth when everyone else chose to look the other way. She will grow up knowing that sometimes justice requires ordinary people to take extraordinary action, and that standing up for what's right is more important than maintaining comfortable lies. As I write this story, it's been 2 years since I mailed that envelope to Eleanor Croft. Dr. Alistair Croft never returned to our hospital, Dr. Jessica Reynolds never completed her residency, and I continue to work as a senior nurse with the respect and authority that 15 years of excellence should command. The surgical suite runs more smoothly now, with proper protocols maintained and patient safety prioritized above all else. New interns learn from experienced nurses instead of believing they know better, and the toxic atmosphere of protected incompetence has been replaced by genuine professional development. Sometimes I wonder if I did the right thing. Sometimes I question whether I had the right to insert myself into Dr. Croft's personal life, whether his marital problems were really any of my business, whether there might have been another way to address his professional misconduct. But then I remember the contaminated instrument that Dr. Reynolds tried to use on a patient's heart. I remember the arrogance, the dismissal, the plan to force me into retirement. I remember that Dr. Croft's betrayal wasn't limited to his wife. It extended to every patient who trusted him, every colleague who respected him, and every principle that makes medicine something more than just another job. Most importantly, I remember that justice isn't always served through official channels. Sometimes it requires ordinary people to take extraordinary action. Sometimes it requires a senior nurse to make sure that a pregnant woman knows the truth about her husband's character before she brings his child into the world. The surgeon was sleeping with the new intern, and everyone knew it. But only one person was willing to make sure that the person who most needed to know actually found out. That person was me, and I would do it again in a heartbeat. If this story resonated with you, if you believe that sometimes justice requires us to step outside the normal boundaries of professional courtesy and social convention, then I want to hear from you in the comments. Do you think there are limits to revenge when innocent people are being hurt, Do you believe that exposing someone's betrayal is justified when that betrayal is destroying families and compromising professional integrity? Hit that like button if you think Eleanor Croft deserved to know the truth, and subscribe to Hospital Revenge for more stories about the dark side of medicine and the people who refuse to let corruption go unpunished. Because in the halls of our hospitals, behind the sterile walls and professional facades, there are stories of power, betrayal, and the kind of justice that can only be served by those brave enough to act when the system fails. This is Hospital Revenge, where the truth always finds a way to surface, and consequences always catch up with those who think they're untouchable. Until next time, remember, in the game of hospital politics, the house doesn't always win.